to share his stories and share his work with us. Please join me in welcoming Tope Folarin. Many people know about, okay, wait. How many of you have heard of brittle paper? Put your hand up. Let's see. Oh, good. She's famous. She really is. She's been giving us all the literary gist, promoting new voices, shining a light on Black and African excellence. She's a hero, and we love her, and we're delighted to have her here all the way from the University of Wisconsin. Please welcome Ainehi Edoro.
Hello. This one's working.
Hello.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Are you having fun? Okay, good. First of all, the previous panel was absolutely amazing. And it's one of the many reasons why this is such a special space. And I have a profound respect and love for people like Lola Shoneyin, who produce these kinds of electrifying spaces for us. To think safely and to share ideas. Today we are going to be talking about a very special book. Do you have a copy? Okay. I have the electronic version, thank you. A very special book, A Particular Kind of Black Man, published by Tope Folarin. It was published on August 6th, and it has received a ton of love from critics. The NPR, the LA Review of Books, and the New York Times, just to name a few, have written reviews, and all the reviews have been glowing. Tope has been touring all over, and he's been featured in a ton of radio shows. So clearly, critics are very excited about this book. Wana Udobang made an Instagram post about the book the other day, and she described the book as devastatingly beautiful, but she also says it's a collection of love stories.
Nobody knew who I was at all. I remember I went on Twitter and people were saying, who is this person? And they were making fun of me. And you were the first person to sort of make a positive comment about my story. And I was actually featured on Brittle Paper. So you've done an incredible job, I think, in terms of, as Lola said, finding talent, cultivating that talent, providing a space for people to be creative. And you certainly did that for me. So thank you very much for all you've done for me and for African literature in general. And of course, I have to throw in my love as well for Ms. Lola for everything she's done in putting this forum together as well. My story is a story about protagonist of my novel is Nigerian parents. He's born and raised in the U.S. And so he's really confused about his identity. He has no sense of who he is and who he's supposed to be. And so because his parents are from Nigeria, they say to him, "You are a Nigerian." Because he's a black person in America, everyone says, well, you're an African American. But he's growing up in a place where there are no other black people around, and so he doesn't know what it means to be an African American. And in addition to that, his parents are going through the struggles that many immigrants go. I think it's something that we all grapple with. I mean, even if we grow up in a society in which there's a solid sense of who we're supposed to be, many of us in this, I see so many of you on your phones, throughout this process, throughout this festival. And the exciting thing about living in the 21st century is that we have access to all kinds of stories, all kinds of identities. And we have the option, too, of saying, well, this thing that I've read about this person who lives in some far-flung country away from me is saying something that I can relate to, and perhaps there's something of them in me, and vice versa. And so it's really a story about how you take different parts of yourself and try to create something whole.
Thank you. The title of the book, A Particular Kind of Black Man, is very striking. And I think that many times, titles tell us a lot about a book. It's understated, But when you hear it, precisely because it's understated, it doesn't sound like a title. It's not like the Game of Thrones, the Lord of the Rings, right?
That was my first option, but I decided not to do that.
Right. It's just very unassuming, right? A particular kind of black man, but then you have a double take, right? There's something about the title that makes me remember The Danger of a Single Story. A particular black man, the danger of a single story. And I think that both titles refer to the harm that is done when we deny people the right to their complexity, right? When we deny people the right to be complicated and the right to reject whatever expectation we have of them, that there is a particular way to be a black man. So can you maybe help us think us through the title? What inspired it, and what kinds of questions were you hoping a reader should ask themselves when they encounter a book with that title?
It's a great question. I think titles are incredibly important. And my sort of view, a title should do a couple things. One, it should kind of summarize what the book is about in a very short and punchy way. And it should also invite the reader to experience what's happening in the book. And I thought that a particular kind of black man really captures the essence of what my protagonist, Tunde, is experiencing. He's growing up in a situation in which his father says that in order to be successful, you have to be a particular kind of black man. And for his father, that means you have to be the kind of black man who's acceptable to white people. And so think you are growing up in this context and you fashion this identity that's not about honoring who you are or who you want to be, it's about satisfying someone else. And that's what so many people who grow up across the world experience. Your parents might say, well, in order to be successful, you have to stop drawing. Or in order to be successful, you have to deny this basic part of who you are. In Tunde's case, his father says you have to be the kind of black person that we see who is successful, which is to say the kind of black person who doesn't scare white people, who makes white people excited about your presence. And so he constructs an identity based on that message. And he comes to find as the book progresses that he's entered a crisis point because he has no idea who he is. At one point, his grandmother says, you have to discover the things that make you laugh and make you cry. Tunde doesn't know what makes him laugh and what makes him cry because his entire identity, his entire life has been about satisfying other people. And so I thought the title itself captured that experience of being kind of marooned from who you actually are and how difficult that can actually be.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the grandmother's statement about, trying to find what makes you laugh and what makes you cry. Because in a way, it speaks to the emotional impactfulness of this story. There are different kinds of books, right? There are books that make us, that are just pleasurable in this. And I have to say, in my experience with reading this book, it was precisely that you're not ready for the kind of emotional intensity that involves in reading this book, that it's intimate, it's measured, but it's emotionally layered. I found myself, teary-eyed, goosebumped, because it gets at those things that we all share, that for many of us, we feel constricted by certain ways that society tries to define us. But there's also something very, something that I think of as a kind of Achebean tenderness in the way you write.
I like that phrase, I'm using it.
In the sense that it is a very economically written text. It's very pared down, because I'm saying emotional does not mean that it is sensational. There's no sensationality about it, but it's not clinical. It's just, it's a text, is a story that makes you as a reader feel emotionally validated, okay? Moving from there, I want us to think about the ways in which your life could be placed in relationship to this text. The book is about a boy, they come from Nigeria, they live in Utah, and then he moves through the country quite a bit. You said that the mother said, the grandmother told him that he needs to look for things that makes him laugh and makes him cry. In your NPR interview, when you talk about your own experience as a Nigerian kid coming to America, you say that one of the ways that you were able to find freedom for yourself within the constricting racial world of America is because you were able to find things that made you laugh and made you cry. So there are correspondences between you and this kid, between you and his life, right? Can you maybe help us think a little bit about this character that is haunted by you as a real-life author?
That's a beautiful way of putting it. And I think that's certainly the case. So with respect to the grandmother character, I spoke to, I grew up in Utah, and so there are many kind of connections between myself and the protagonist, but I spoke to my grandmother, both of my grandmothers, maybe 3 or 4 times throughout my entire life. And so that part is fictional, but there's also a yearning there. You know, I wish I could have spoken to my Nigerian family more often. And there were any number of reasons that we didn't, partly because long distance was so expensive in the 80s and 90s. And so whenever my dad was on the phone with Nigeria, first of all, he was screaming at the top of his lungs because the connection was bad. So when he was screaming, we knew he was talking to someone in Nigeria. And second, if anybody tarried on the phone, he would get upset and talk about the fact that, you know, we weren't to be eating our pizza next month because we had spent all the time on the phone. And so I wanted to kind of create a fictional space where Tunde is able to have some connection to somebody who loves him unconditionally and who can teach him how to be an adult, teach him how to be a true human being. But in terms of the broader kind of parameters of your question, yeah, there's certainly any number of similarities between myself and the protagonist. I think what happens, and anybody who writes probably experiences this, the moment you sit down to write, if you are really in that space where you're starting to write, you'll discover that the thing that you're writing will begin to take on a life of its own. And so oftentimes people will say, well, this is your autobiography. And I say, have you tried to write yours? Because what you'll discover is that you'll have to check yourself constantly because the character will start doing things that you never did and start thinking in a way that you never have. And so that's what happened to me when I started writing this book. I initially thought that perhaps I'm writing my memoir, but then I discovered that Tunde, he became Tunde, he wasn't Tunde initially, was doing all kinds of things and having all kinds of experiences that I never had. And I'm informed by fiction that kind of responds to and correlates with life. So I read a great deal of John Updike when I was growing up, for example, and he's somebody who writes from his life. There's an entire strand of fiction now that's called autofiction, in which people are writing explicitly from their life. Amongst them are people like Teju Cole, for example, Rachel Cusk, Ben Lerner, famously Knausgaard, the Sebald as well obviously did this. And that's a tradition that I really like, and I think there's much to glean from that tradition. And so I think I'm writing in a kind of auto-fictional way, but my novel is more fictional than perhaps I anticipated when I started.
Thank you. So Tope is going to read one passage for us, a very, very short passage, and then we'll move on, just to give you a sense of the cadence and the texture of the story and his writing.
Okay, this section strikes at the heart of his identity question, the questions that Tunde is asking himself all the time. This was my main problem. I had no idea how to be black. I mean, I was black, I am black, I can't change that, but I had no idea how to be a black American, an African American. Even though I'd spent my entire life in America, I had no idea how to be black like Will Smith, like Michael Jordan, like many of the black people I frequently saw on TV. I always felt somewhat bewildered when I saw them, especially when I saw a group of black people together at a concert, on a team, at a church service, in a classroom. The way they greeted each other, the way they laughed, they seemed to share something in common that was completely lacking in me. The few times I told my father how I felt, he responded the same way. He told me not to worry, that if I worked hard enough and became successful, people would want to be like me. I took solace in his words for many years.
Thank you. Just with
Thank you.
With a show of hands, how many people think that they were born to be who they are? How many people think that they were made into what they are? That you were made into what you are? Okay. that so this text kind of gets at the heart of the fact that what you are, for example, I am a woman, I am a Nigerian woman, I am a Nigerian woman living in America, right? I am a literature professor, I am a mother. These are all things that I am, right? But the difference between the moment I was born as this thing, how I went from there to becoming this different thing is a very complicated journey. And it's a journey that doesn't always have a blueprint. And it can also be a very painful journey for many people, especially within the context that this character lives. But in order for me to ask the next question, I want to refer to something that Titilope Shonuga said. She's somebody who has written in her poetry a lot about becoming. In an interview published on Brittle Paper, this is what she said. On the journey to becoming yourself, there is this constant and sometimes painful juggling act between who you want to be and the voices in and around your head. There is always this enormous pressure to have it all together. And we assume that everyone else does too. So we all suffer in silence. So I want to ask you, because this is precisely what you've beautifully chronicled in this book, the pain and the hurt of this boy becoming a particular kind of black man. So what role do you think racism plays in this character's pain and hurt and struggle of becoming? How does it complicate it?
Racism informs a lot. I mean, the thing about growing up in a place like the U.S. is that, especially my parents are very religious, they're Christians. And so you are going to church on a consistent basis, and everything around you says that if you want to be successful, here's the pathway to success. You go to church, you see white hippie Jesus smiling down at you, you know? And this is a person who doesn't, and you feel like you have to, he's a stand-in for everyone else in your life, in a way. Like, if I can satisfy this deity who looks like the people I go to school with, or looks like their parents, at least their fathers, then maybe I will be successful. Maybe somebody will see something good in me. And there is never a question about, especially in a place like America where racism is so pronounced, there's never a question about who am I actually? What makes me happy? The people, my dad was like many immigrants in that he was always critical of African Americans. He thought that they weren't doing enough in America. He thought they were lazy. He had any number of critiques about them. And so when I was growing up, that seemed like a viable pathway, because at least with African Americans, I saw that they seemed to reject the kind of common narrative about how to be in America. They had their own kind of music, they wore their clothes their own way. And so for me, that was an incredibly alluring thing and something that I wanted to be connected to. But then, and because it was forbidden, my father said that's not the pathway. Of course I was intrigued by it, like many kids are. So I, in some ways began to kind of experiment with that kind of way of being. But yeah, racism is profoundly important, and it colors everything from the way you see yourself. I was the first black kid in my elementary school, in my lower school. And so I remember, and this is chronicled in the book, when I first went to school, somebody started rubbing my skin because they had never seen a black person before. They thought if they rubbed it, the brown would come off and the white would appear underneath. And it was the first time that I became cognizant of the fact that I was different. I thought I was just another kid, but now I know that I'm different from these people that I've grown up with. And there are any number of incidents that were similar to that I suffered through. And I kind of quickly discovered that because I wanted to be successful, that I had to become the kind of person that was acceptable to these people. And so that's an experience that's born of growing up in a racist system. And it's something that my parents never anticipated. They wanted the best for their kids. And so going to America was the best. But they were ill prepared for the kind of psychological impact of growing up in a place, of raising kids in a place where they are completely different from everyone else, and how that can permanently scar the kids as well.
Right. And not just that they are different, right? Because different is not inherently bad, but that your difference marks you as being lesser than, right?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, not many people have caught this, but there's a moment at the beginning of the story where the two kids, Tunde and his brother, they see their father naked. And I was thinking I grew up in Utah, and so that was something that I heard all the time. It was either the curse of Cain or the curse of Ham. It was this notion that because I had dark skin, that somewhere down the line, one of my ancestors had been cursed, and I was bearing that curse. And that was something I thought about a great deal when I was young. When I was far too young to be thinking, instead of thinking about, playing with action figures, I was thinking about the curse of Ham when I was very young and how maybe that impacted me. So, it's a kind of literary illusion that I try to inject in the text, and I understand, it's pretty subtle, but I was trying to draw attention to that notion that there seems to be this kind of systemic curse, yes, unfortunately, that many people of color suffer through in the States, in Europe, in Canada, in many places in the West.
Yeah. And I'm happy that you mentioned systemic racism as a kind of systemic problem, right? Because one thing that characterizes all your characters is that they love to dream. And dream is an organizing principle in the story. Everybody's dreaming. Dreaming is something that they used to survive for Tunde. At some point, in fact, he begins to not know the difference between, he just gets lost into this dreaming spree. But then dreams can also kill you, right? Because if your dreams don't pan out the right way, it could break you. Yeah. So I want to ask you about how dreams can also be systemically defined. Because, we all dream, but not all dreams are equal. Yeah. If you are a middle-class white man, there's a way that your dream is more likely to come true, yeah, as opposed to if you're a black kid in Utah. So can you maybe help us think about how racism complicates the idea of dreaming as something that we all do, but that we don't all find fulfillment for in the same way?
Dreaming is incredibly important for human beings, and I'm glad that you talked about the kind of potentially negative aspects of dreaming. Tunde's mother has a dream about America, and it's a dream that she's inherited from everything she's seen on television, from the books she's read, from the music she has listened to. And that dream says to her that America is this incredible land of promise, that if you just go there, you'll be kind of walking around in a place where everything's great, you have big houses, everything else. And this is a story that we've all heard any number of times, because it's a story that many people have experienced. She gets to America, obviously reality doesn't align at all with her dream, and that's what in some ways begins to break her, because she's a dreamer, and she's coming to grips with the fact that her dream cannot become reality, and that's very difficult for her. Tunde dreams as well, as you say. And this, for me, is incredibly important, because what I began to recognize, and I only began to recognize this when I committed myself to becoming an artist, and this was a thing that I decided in grad school. I said, I'm going to become the best artist I can, and that means I'm going to go to every lecture about art, I'm going to go to every museum, I'm going to read every book, I'm going to commit myself wholly to this life. The thing that began to happen was that something changed within me. And the thing that changed within me is that I was beginning to define the kind of life that I wanted for myself, as opposed to just taking on whatever had been given to me by my parents or by society or whatever else. The second thing I recognized was that the reality that I inhabit was not constructed for my benefit, right? And that for me was a really powerful thought. I'm walking around and I've been raised in this situation in which I think I have to do certain things in order to be successful. And I come to understand that it's a reality that was made to ensure that white men are successful, not for me. And so everybody is going through that point. Everybody is saying that the more like a white man I am, the more successful I will be. And that kind of story doesn't have space for different experiences, right? For different cultural ways of seeing and being. And so when I began to recognize that reality wasn't constructed for the likes of me, I said, can I construct a new reality? And that's what Tunde does in the book at the end. He says, I'm going to construct a reality. And a lot of people haven't read that the way I intended. And I think it's because they're kind of so committed to this reality that we currently inhabit, this reality that wasn't made to benefit the likes of us. And this goes across the board. If you're a woman, the reality wasn't created for you. It was created for men, right? If you are gay, it wasn't created for you. If you have anything that's outside the norm, it wasn't created for you. And so the question becomes, as we have creativity, art is one way we can begin to construct a new reality for ourselves. And that's what I've tried to do in my work. Every time I write a story, I'm trying to create a reality that has space for someone like me, or for someone who's been marginalized their entire lives.
We're now going to read the second short passage.
This is a part of the book when Tunde is seeing that his father is being abused by his mother. One morning, my brother shook me awake and told me that Dad was crying. I did not believe him. I didn't think such a thing was possible. We scrambled to the living room and saw Mom standing over Dad, her eyes boiling with rage. My father was naked. His clothes, now nothing more than torn rags, were arrayed haphazardly around the room. He was bleeding from a wound on his thigh, and his face was wreathed in a constellation of sweat and tears. My brother and I reached over to him, but Mom cursed at us. "Get the hell out of here."
Thank you. So, that particular passage I found very moving. And it's just so sad to look at this man. He's crying and whimpering in his room, and his sons see him, right? It's a very striking representation of masculine pain, right? So I want us to maybe talk about masculinity and vulnerability for a second, right? That why was it important? And you represented beautifully, because there's a way to represent vulnerability in men that actually perpetuates normative masculinity. But this image is so striking that it shows you a different view of what it means to be vulnerable as a man. Why was that important to you?
Because I wanted to present a full picture of malehood, and one that isn't informed by this kind of societal dictate that says that men have to be constantly aggressive, they can't show emotion, they can't show how tired they are, how weak they may feel, that sort of thing. I'm fortunate in that I grew up with a father who was, I think, more in tune with his emotion than some other Nigerian men that I've met in my life. And he's still very much a Nigerian man in sort of the cliched ways, but my father was unafraid, for example, of saying that he loved us. He said it all the time, constantly. And he also, one of the reasons I'm convinced that I've had some success in my life is that my dad would often treat me like I was an advisor. So if he wanted to start a new business, for example, he would go to the store and buy a book, and he would read about business, and then he would pass it off to me. I was all of 7 or 8, and then he would say, "Read this book, and then when you're done, we can talk about how we're going to do this together." And I remember being overwhelmed completely by what I was reading. I didn't understand half of it, but I felt a sense of pride that my father wanted my advice, that he wanted me to help him in whatever he was doing. And he often, the thing that often happens when you grow up as the child of an immigrant is that you understand the society that you live in better than your parents do. My dad came to America when he was in his, I think, mid to late 20s. And so by the time I'm 9 or 10, I'm a translator for him. Both literally, sometimes people can't understand his accent, and also figuratively as well. Sometimes we'll be in a new situation, and he doesn't understand what he's saying, and he looks to me, and then I'll say, well, this is what was happening, of what was going on. And I just think it's really difficult to write a book without kind of capturing that. The second thing I'll say it very quickly, is that I was fortunate enough to, I participated in this Kane Prize workshop. It must have been 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. And a number of people were there. Namwali Serpel was there, Novalet Bulawayo was there, El Nathan was there. There were a number of us who were there. We were all very sort of competitive, and we were workshopping our stories. And so because we all aspire to be the best writers of our generation, we were very, very tough on each other. And I submitted an excerpt of the novel to them, and they challenged me about vulnerability. They challenged me about female characters, and they challenged me about vulnerability. So when I went back home, I thought, well, if I want to have a novel that actually breathes and lives, I can't kind of ignore the parts of masculinity that maybe I sometimes shrink away from because I don't want people to see those parts of me. I think a book cannot live and exist until you put all of yourself into it. So that's what I decided to do.
Just quickly on the issue of masculinity and vulnerability. The last 2 days we've had this just very informative and moving and difficult conversation around getting in touch with their vulnerability, right? As opposed to kind of presenting and projecting this macho personality. How do you think that could help us in some way kind of reimagine what it means to be men in a way that can actually open up a much more safer world for women?
The man who walks around and doesn't admit that he cries, that he's sad, that he has vulnerability is not a human being. That's the bottom line. And so we live in a society in which you have all these men who are kind of play acting at manhood, or they're kind of showing what they think a man is supposed to be. And in the process of doing, they're denying their very humanity, right? And so if you're not being a true human being, it's not, obviously, you're going to strike out. You'll hit the woman you're with. You'll be aggressive and dismissive of other people's feelings. You won't be a human being. And so we have to get to a place where we embrace all of our humanity, and that includes the parts that are difficult about being a human. The depression that might come, the sadness that might come, the joy that comes, the fact that every man has, some femininity in him as well. And if you're running away from that, again, you're running from a basic part of who you are. So I think one of the great things about, being an artist is that it's difficult to kind of try to chronicle lives if you're not trying to be in touch with that as well, the kind of basic humanity we all have. You can't create a living, breathing character unless you are in tune with that. One of the best things that I did when I decided to write this book is that I spent 1 year reading poetry. And I spent 1 year doing nothing but reading women writers. I refused to read men writers. And I learned a lot about the way, and part of the reason I did this, I'll be completely honest, is that I admired the women who had, they were writing and they were simultaneously being mothers and they had jobs and they're still producing incredible work. Toni Morrison comes to mind, Alice Munro. There are a number of writers who have done this, and I was trying to envision a life for myself where I could be involved in politics, which I love, and have a family, and also be an artist. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll read their work. So I started with that premise, but the more I read them, the more I began to get a fuller sense of humanity. Because the other thing, too, is that if you read just exclusively male writers, often you get lost in the machismo. They're trying to kind of play out the machismo on the page as well. But if you're reading women, you're reading about kids and how they struggle. You're reading about the fears and desires and hopes that women have. And you're also connecting yourself in a really tangible way to the human experience in an undistilled way. It's not distilled through the kind of layers of like masculinity and I can't show people I'm weak. It's just a kind of undistilled version of what it means to be a human being. So I think I benefited from that as well.
It's wonderful. So I'm going to kind of poke you a little bit with this question.
Yeah, poke.
Okay. So the women in your story are very flawed.
Yeah.
His mother is, I would say, in literature, is like the classic motif of the monstrous mother, right? Who is not nurturing, who wants to kill, who hurts you instead of, nurturing you. And then also there is his stepmother, who also fails him. I don't want to give away plot details, who fails him too. But then the father is not perfect, but there's a way that sometimes his father is presented as his superhero dad. There's a time, he talks about my father who keeps hunger at bay, my father who fought off the forces of sadness, my father who vanquished our fear. Superhero language. Yeah. So why though? Why do you, what tension are you trying to explore here?
Yeah. It's an important question because it's something I grappled with for a long time. To the extent that I can be a feminist, I consider myself a feminist, and I didn't want to write a book in which I'm not sort of honoring the female characters. That's very important to me. But at the same time, there's a question of trying to show why Tunde is the way he is. And part of that is because he doesn't have a mother's love. His grandmother features, and she's a character who gives him that kind of love that he needs. She's a character, perhaps, that he kind of begins to see as a godlike figure at one point as the text progresses. And then at one point in the book, Tunde meets a woman as well, and she, I think, is perhaps a more fully formed human than, even though, one could argue that she also just serves a purpose in his life to get him to the next stage. I understand that. It's something that's very difficult, and I think I needed to write the characters this way for this story. I promise for the next book that things will be different.
Okay. Two more questions. And I don't know, I want us to maybe talk about fun stuff now. So in this book, there's a ton of references to music in the story. It's one of the centers around which the characters' lives are configured, right? So for example, the mother is said to have fallen for the music of the Beatles. There's one time when he talks about, he says, the musical notes curling out of the speakers. The character talks about how music lifted his soul. He also says, you always wanted to hold the music, to feel it pulse and thrum against your palms, to feel it wriggle defiantly away. Like, why is music so important? And you mentioned like an endless list of musicians: Tammy Faye Baker, Whitney Houston, the Beatles, Houdini, Lionel Richie, Boyz II Men, Mariah Carey, Aaron Hall, Sunny Ade. Why? What is music doing for your characters?
Well, it's because I love music, and I think the thing that I came to recognize as I was writing this book is that I've always been drawn to art, but I didn't have the language to kind of articulate that when I was younger. I remember my dad didn't allow us to listen to popular music when I was growing up. So the one thing I used to cherish is that whenever we went to the department store, I would hear pop music. And so I loved going to the department store, not because I was going to get a new pair of shoes or some pants, but because I was going to be able to listen to music. And that became very, very important to me. And my parents didn't have enough money, for example, to allow us for me to have piano lessons. I really wanted to have piano lessons. And much later, I determined that the reason why I wanted these things is because I was an artist and I was figuring out it was part of my journey to becoming myself. And so I think for Tunde as well, art is incredibly important. And music is his pathway too. He's not growing up in a situation in which his parents are taking him to museums or in which he's watching like nice artful films, but he has access to the artistic genius and talent of these musicians that you just mentioned and many more. And these are the people that help him to kind of get a sense of who he is and who he wants to be. So, and music, I love, I'm obsessed with music, so I couldn't help myself. I had to kind of throw in some of the folks that I love.
Wonderful. I want to close because I would like for us to have a few minutes for people to ask questions. The last word in the book is home. And for a book that is about homelessness and exile, being constantly on the move, because one of the problems with this character's life and one of the sources of his trauma is that they are always on the move. He could never, anywhere he thinks for a moment is home, he loses, right? So this is a text that is about homelessness and how it ravages us and how it complicates the process of becoming, right? And home is a word that has been vilified, right? If we want to be, philosophical, it's been deconstructed to death. Home is like this bad word, right? Why do you end with home? What is home doing for you?
I think at the end of my book that I'm not giving anything away when I say this, but I think that Tunde has created a home for himself. And that's something that I had to do. I didn't do it the way that Tunde did. But I grew up, as we've said already, in similar circumstances. And so for economic reasons, we moved constantly when I was growing up. We didn't move as much as Tunde does, but we moved a great deal. And so I was constantly having to reconfigure myself in new contexts, and that was very difficult. And the thing that would make me upset sometimes is that my friends, I'd go to a place and I'd have new friends, and they would talk about something that had happened 4 or 5 years before, and I could never be a part of those stories because 4 or 5 years before I'd been somewhere else. And so the question becomes, I think humans need home as well, but I think we also have the option of creating a home for ourselves, and that's something that I've done in terms of my practice as an artist, in terms of a kind of physical space and location, and in terms of my beliefs and ideals. And I think it's difficult to ask a child to do that because a child just wants to belong. Every child, you don't want to be teased, you want to be part of a group, and if you don't have the option of kind of having that life, sometimes you kind of thrust on this path where you have to begin to kind of identify and construct a home for yourself. And so I think eventually that's what Tunde has to do.
And so if for example, if racism didn't disappear, right? If you still have these structural forms of oppression that structures his life, right? What does it mean to imagine home for a character like this in spite of the fact that the very things that complicate his process of becoming, those structural things, still persist?
I think he has to find a place within himself, and that's what he does. I mean, at some point, I think for many again, if you're not a white man, I think that oftentimes that your entire process of being is about broadcasting something externally. Everything is about that, the way you dress, the way you speak, and it's either in rejection of or accept. I think at a certain point in the novel, Tunda says, okay, I'm no longer concerned with the process of becoming a particular kind of black man. Who the hell am I inside? And I think, and maybe I can find some notion or sense of home inside of myself and begin the process of living a life that, again, aligns with the person I actually am. And so that's a really difficult thing to do because it's not the way we're raised. I mean, any number of us, I think, even if your parents aren't immigrants, your parents have a plan for you. And much of that plan is often about, again, capitulating to things that are beyond your control. It's about sort of developing this persona that satisfies other people. But what about if you turn that around and say, what makes me happy? I think you have a much more fulfilling life if that's the path that you decide to take. It's a difficult path, but in the end, I think it's the more fruitful path.
Thank you very much. We'll take you.
Hello. Let me first thank Edoro for rejecting the piles of work I've been sending to British paper since the last 6 months. Yeah. And my question...
You got to keep working.
All right. And my question to Folarin is, how far have winning Ken Prize impacted in your career as a writer? Yeah.
I won the Kane Prize for the first story I'd ever written called Miracle. And so the reason why it was really impactful was that I went from a place where I was trying to submit stories. I'd submitted, I think, 150 stories before I had my first story accepted. And I actually had an Excel spreadsheet in which I had notched all the rejections. And so I got this acceptance, and I was incredibly happy. And then someone said, well, I think this is a very powerful story. Perhaps you should encourage your publisher to submit it for the Kane Prize. And so I did. And then I found out a few months later that I had been shortlisted. And so think about going from 0 to 1,000 miles an hour, basically. And I'm on the short list with these writers I respect and admire. And suddenly I'm in London answering, trying to sound very sophisticated while answering literary questions. And using all kinds of 4-syllable words and describing my text, and I wasn't sure how it would work out, but then I was fortunate enough to win, and all of a sudden, and the thing that's interesting too is that you go from no one reading the work to like going on Twitter and people saying, oh, this guy's horrible now. Come on, why is this guy shortlisted for the Kane? I can write better, and then it hurts a little bit initially, and then some people say, oh, he's the most incredible person ever. It's a really interesting thing to have people engage with your work that way when you've not experienced that before. And so I think the great thing about the Kane Prize is that people were paying attention to my work, and that's what every artist wants. You want someone to pay attention to your work. Sometimes they might not like it, sometimes they might love it, but at least they're spending some part of their very important time engaging with the work, and that's incredibly important. But the other side too is that, so now I've won the Kane Prize, and then the next thing is everyone's email, well, when's the novel, when's the novel, when's the novel? And if you don't produce a novel in a couple years, they're like, this one can't write a novel now. This one's, he's very lazy. He can't write a novel. And so there's that. And if I hadn't won, if I was just still writing obscurity, nobody would care. So it definitely kind of, there's some pressure as well to produce, which I welcome, but it's something that I had not experienced before. Thanks.
Folarin, because I remember when that story was shortlisted and then won, there was a lot of talk about the fact that you were a first-generation Nigerian. There was a lot of identity. It was an interesting set of conversation happened around that. Can you maybe just take us through what that was, even in terms of becoming? All of a sudden, you became an African writer overnight. You became a Nigerian writer overnight. And then there are people saying, no, you are not Nigerian enough. You are not African enough. What was that like for you? It's
a great question because this book wouldn't be this book without the Kane Prize. It was deeply influenced by my experience with the Kane Prize. And when I won, there was all this there was a lot of negativity that I experienced. People questioned my experience. People questioned my identity. People said that you're not Nigerian enough. People mocked me. They mocked the way I talked. They mocked my background and everything else. And again, it's an opportunity to say, okay, who do I want to be? Am I going to begin to construct a persona that satisfy these people that say I'm not Nigerian enough or African enough, or am I going to continue living in my truth? And my truth is that my parents are from Nigeria, that Nigeria was very important to them, and they passed that along to me as well. And I grew up in a Nigerian household in America. But that I also grew up in America, and that's a core part of who I am as well. And part of what I'm saying, my presence is about complicating this notion that you can only be one thing at a time, right? Like, I am many things. And I think for many people that was confusing initially. They said, well, I choose one side or the other, be one thing or the other. And I would just quietly insist in my work and in terms of the way that I am in the world that no, I am more than that. And that's not rejecting any part of myself. But that's just saying that if I reject, my American side or my Nigerian side or whatever, or in terms of even my Nigerian side, I'm Yoruba and Igbo because my mom is Igbo and my father's Yoruba. Like the point that I begin to reject something, that I'm rejecting a core part of who I am, and I can't do that. So I'm glad that happened. I'm glad that happened because I think that I was able to write a novel about the kind of hybrid experience that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So, yeah.
Yes.
Good evening. My name is Precious. From the title of your novel, sir, I want to know who is the particular kind of man. Like from the title, I'm anxious to know the person in the text. And please, what gave you the inspiration to write the novel? And what is behind the title of the text?
Well, the title is referring to the kind of black person that Tuna feels he's supposed to be. And that he is for much of the book. He's the kind of black man that is supposed to, make white people comfortable, to make mainstream society comfortable. And as the book progresses, he begins to reject that. So that's where the title came from.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Tope Folarin. I've been a follower of your work since you. Okay, I've been an ardent follower of your work since it was first released I first saw it in 2013 when it was shortlisted.
Thank you.
Earlier you were talking about how that characters kind of take on a form of their own. They take on brains of their own. Now, as a writer who wants to retain control most of the time, how do you strike a balance between allowing characters just rove, like just letting the story lead you, and then trying to maintain control of everything, as in the whole writing process? That's the way the story goes. That's number one. And also, you also, in answering the first question, you talked about some people, of course, not really liking your story and, of course, giving you some kind of not so good feedback. I want to know, how do you deal with these critics? And secondly, how do you deal with the fear of, okay, in a way, fading out? Okay, you're not able to write another story after the first one. How do you deal with that fear? Thank you very much.
So in response to your first question, I would say don't try to control the story. That's in it. Don't just let it do what it wants to do. And I think when you're trying to control it, then you're preventing yourself from accessing whatever it is that is inspiring that story in the first place. Just let it happen. I think criticism is fine. I mean, the thing that I recognized very early on in this process is that if I try to write a book that satisfies everyone, or a story or whatever, then it's not going to be very good. I mean, because there's no part of myself. There are parts of me that people might not understand or relate to, and part of my job as an artist is to kind of render that as well as I can. And if somebody comes to it and still doesn't like it, that's completely fine. There have been many books that people have said to me, this is the most amazing book of all time, and I read it, I'm like, that's not for me. Same with movies, and that's fine. We all bring who we are to our experience of art, and that's completely fine. And I think, too, the last question about sort of the fear of producing, I would say that if you are kind of committed to the craft of whatever it is you're doing, for me, the lifesaver has been my wholehearted commitment to craft, to the craft of being an artist and the craft of writing. And when you kind of respect the craft, you recognize that, one, you have to show up every day at your desk and just write. It might not be a really good writing day, but at least you're doing something. And the sentences themselves will lead you where you need to go. I didn't think about the pressure because I knew that there are novels inside of me and that I just had to give them the space to come out. And so my responsibility is to, one, to continue to feed myself as an artist, which is to say, continue to watch films, continue to read books, continue to do everything I can, to read what my colleagues are doing, and two, to show up on my desk every night. And the thing will work itself out.
Thank you so much, Folarin. Tope.
Thank you.
We can take two more. Okay. Awesome.
So,
hold on. Yeah. Sure, go.
Okay, sorry. Hello. Your novel is wonderful. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I think my question is something about like your stories, from your short stories to this novel. You have a lot of characters, but they're quite distilled, and when I read it, it's your writing is quiet, and I wonder if that is deliberate, why it is that way for you. What drew you to sort of that style of like being very intimate and being able to distill all of these many characters and many things that are happening to a very sort of singular rhythm, where you're not quite distracted by so much going on?
That's a great question, because I think it really goes to a matter of voice. And it took me a long time to find my voice. Like many people, when I started writing, I would just copy whatever it was that I was reading. I remember at one point I was obsessed with George Saunders, the short story writer. And so my next 20 stories were George Saunders stories. But it was very embarrassing. But I was very proud of them. I was like, yes, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. They never quite hit right, though. And then for a moment, I was obsessed with Jhumpa Lahiri, so every story was basically Lahiri light, and I was reading her and writing Lahiri's stories. I did this for years, and it wasn't until maybe 2012 that I finally said, I settled into something that made sense for me. And the way I knew that it was my voice was that it felt like home, here's that word again, it felt like home the way I was writing. And two, I was able to kind of actually produce in that voice in a way that I hadn't been before. Before, when I was just aping whatever I'd read, I was basically writing stories that were very similar to the people I admired. But when I started writing, when I discovered my voice, I began to tell stories that felt like authentic to me. And so that took a lot of time. I know some people discover their voices relatively quickly, but I think that's a real thing, like figuring out what your voice is. And it doesn't mean that you always write in the same meter with the same pacing, but you discover where your place of where your kind of identity as a writer or as an artist is. And I think that you don't really begin to produce great work until you find that space.
One more question.
Hello.
Hey.
Abdul Karim here.
Yes.
I have a very simple question. I'm genuinely curious. Your work is really successful, critically acclaimed and all that. Do you feel any, sophomore blues, any pressure to, be better in your next, maybe, outing?
Well, yes, I do feel, but that's internal pressure. Like, I'm always open about this. I'm a very, very ambitious person, and I have big goals and dreams, and I don't back down from that at all. So I put pressure on myself to be as great as I can be. But again, that's internal, it's not external. I know people are gonna say whatever they wanna say, but in the end, I have to be able to pick up my book and read it and say, I think that's a good book, and that's the test that I always apply to myself. If I don't think it's good, then I don't care what anybody else says. Conversely, if I think it's good, I don't care what anyone else says. Even if the praise comes, that's fine. If the criticism comes, that's fine. But even with this book, I wanted to produce a book that I was proud of. I think all artists have this moment when you start as an artist and you write something and you think it's the most incredible thing that's ever been written. You go back to it 2 days later and you think, this is mess. This is disgusting nonsense. And I wanted to get to a place where that was no longer the case. And even with writing this book, the book has been finished for about 18 months. But I wanted to put it aside for a moment so I could come back to it maybe 3 or 4 months down the line and read it again and still feel like I had accomplished what I set out to achieve. And so I feel like I have in this book, and I'm about halfway through a second book, and it's not where I want it to be yet, but I know that I will know when it's there, and I'll just continue working on it. And if it takes 10 years and someone said, oh, this guy cannot produce a second novel, I don't care. I'll say thank you on Twitter, I'll respond thank you, and then the second book will drop. So.
Tope, thank you very much for being here with us and for sharing your work and your experiences with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for your excellent questions.
And thank you so much, guys, for sharing this moment with us.
Thank you.
And please join me in thanking